I'm Pat Kenny, and I was born in 1944, July 18th, and I'm from a little town in outside the city of St. Louis, a little municipality called Overland, Missouri, and spent my early years in parochial grade school and got in trouble the summer after my 8th grade with the law a little bit. With nothing serious, but it was enough to grabbed my attention and my mother's attention, and I was one of 7 kids. I was the second oldest. There was 2 boys and 5 girls, and in an Irish Catholic family, it's usually tradition that one of the boys would become a priest. So they always had ideas about one of us, but I got in trouble, so I don't think they were looking at me too strongly as a prospect to be a priest. So the judge gave me an opportunity to either go to reform school or to straighten out my ways, or to go into a military high school. And so my mother chose for me. She chose the military high school, and so I attended Christian Brothers College in St. Louis, Missouri, which was a military prep school as well. And that tended to get me turned on the right track. It didn't complete the job, but this next year, it was obvious my brother wasn't going to become a priest, and so they decided to ask me, and I accepted. I wanted to get as far away from that military high school as I could get. So I went on down to Carthage, Missouri, and spent a year in the seminary there, which did turn my life around quite a bit. And I didn't return there. I just didn't like it. So I finished off at a parochial Catholic high school in St. Louis, Missouri, and graduated in 1962. A lot of talk about Vietnam was going on in those days, the very early days. So I was a blue-collar family. My kids I ran with were from blue-collar families. And so college really wasn't on our horizon. And so one of the things that we were all talking about was where we were going to go to work, what we were going to do. And I didn't apply myself very well during grade school or high school. I just wasn't interested in education, academics. I'd rather be out playing or on some sort of an adventure. And so when it came time for that, I was very confused what I wanted to do. And one of my friends asked me to buddy up with him and join the Navy. He wanted to go into nuclear submarines as an electrician. And everything he talked about just made me think that would sound like a lot of hard study and hard work, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be on the water like that. And then another couple buddies teamed up and went into the Army. And I just couldn't see myself trudging through the mud and blood and guts, and that wasn't for me. I wasn't interested in that. I had another friend of mine who was going off to college on a football scholarship, and I thought, boy, he made a good choice there. And he talked me into going down to Southeast Missouri State College with him. So I went to my mother and I told her, I says, I'm going to head on down to Southeast Missouri at Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and I'm going to go to college. Give it a shot. Well, needless to say, I think that pretty much shocked my mother. We had no kids in college, and that wasn't on the horizon, and we sure didn't have the money for that. And she told me, she says, well, I'll support you all I can, but you know we don't have any money. And I said, well, I'll make my way. So I went on down there and walked on to the football team at Southeast Missouri and didn't make the team. They had so many scholarships, and I wasn't big enough for what they wanted me to do. And so they suggested I spend the next year in a weight program to build up to get to where they wanted me to be. And so I went off and I enrolled in college and didn't do well at all first couple of years. And football went out the back door because I just lost interest and decided to start figuring out how to stay in college. It was a tough time, and I hadn't academically prepared myself at all. So I was struggling with all of that, and happened to meet a very nice young lady, and she went to school eventually where I was. She was a couple years behind me, and my wife Nancy, and she turned my life around by disciplining me on how to study. And we got married in 1966, and I started college in 62, so I should have been out in 66. So that's when I really actually got started on my last 2 years of college with her pushing me. And I majored in biology, and she majored in biology right next to me so she could keep track of me, and just kept pounding on me. And I graduated in 68 with a degree in biology. And I wasn't sure halfway through that time in 1967 what I was going to do when I got out, whether I was going to teach or what I was going to do. What appealed to me was forestry or a game warden job or something like that. That's what appealed to me, and I just was clueless as to how to get there. I just wasn't very good at disciplining myself to do that. And I was walking through the student union one day, and I saw this Navy poster up there about pilots, and I went over and talked to the Navy recruiter, and I said, "What's this all about?" And they told me, he says, "Well, you could graduate and you could be making $9,000 a year as a naval aviator." I said, "Really?" I said, "Well, what does it take? Do you have to know how to fly or anything like that?" "No, you just have to pass these aptitude tests, and you have to be physically qualified. We've got to give you a physical exam." So I went through all of that. I took their tests. They had three or tests, and spatial tests, math tests, and I did fine on them. And then they sent me to Memphis to have a flight physical. First time I'd ever ridden on an airplane in my life, and it was an old C-54. We went down to Memphis. I took my flight physical, passed that, and the recruiter seemed to be very happy. And then I got a notice that they weren't going to take me. So I asked him why, and he says, "Well, the NAVROC program was mostly filled up because sons of people who were already in the Navy were filling that. They got first priority. And so the program I wanted to get into was full." So I kind of dejected and was wandering around, and I had one more year to go. This was like spring of 1967. And I said, "Boy, you got to figure this out." And within a couple of days, there was a Marine recruiter on campus. And my friend that I'd gone down there with football originally, and I were walking through the student union, and I said, "Hey, Jim, come over here and look at this." And there was the same photo, except it was a Marine pilot sitting in the cockpit of an airplane. And I talked to the Marine recruiter. He looked pretty sharp sitting there in his blues, and I went up and talked to him, and he basically told me the exact same story that the Navy guy had told me. And I said, "Well, I already tried for that program." He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I've already taken the Navy tests." He says, "You took the tests?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, what's wrong?" And I said, "Well, I took the flight exam and I passed." "You took their flight physical too and you passed that?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, what's going on?" And I said, "Well, they told me that I'd go up in the story about the NAVROC." He said, "Would you like to become a Marine aviator?" And I said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, raise your right hand." And that was the next step. I mean, I signed on a dotted line, and he said, "Well, there's some formalities. We want to double check that you actually did pass the physicals." So he decided to send me up he checked the scores. I had the scores. He sent me up to Great Lakes, Chicago, to be another flight test, flight physical. So there were four of us, or something, that had to go up there for that. There was myself and Wayne Stevens and Hal Walker. And it was an interesting drive up. We drove up and together, took the physical, got our eyes dilated and couldn't find our way back home, and got stuck in Chicago and lost. But we had a great time and got back. And Wayne became a jet pilot eventually, and Hal became a helicopter 46 pilot in 262. And but they got in there before I did, about 6 months ahead. But come 1968, when I graduated from college, my recruiter was waiting for me. I don't remember his name. I had to meet him down in downtown St. Louis. My mother and my wife went with me. They swore me in again down there, and all official, and I got my commission as a second lieutenant. And I had orders immediately to head to Pensacola, Florida. And I had no idea where I was going, what I was doing, anything about the military. I had been to PLC class the summer of 67 after they had signed me up originally. I spent my 10 weeks in OCS there. They called it a PLC 10-week course, but basically it was OCS. It was nothing new. It was physically demanding, mentally challenging. It was good for me. I didn't break any records. I didn't do anything wrong either. I just kept my mouth shut and made it through. And so when I graduated from college, I drove down to Pensacola. We didn't have a car that was run to Pensacola. We had to go borrow some money for the first time in our lives and get a car. And we got this little tiny Volkswagen and took off down to Florida and showed up at Pensacola, Florida, and got over to the main gate. And it was all awesome to me. It was huge, the Naval Air Station at Pensacola. And we got on base, told them where I wanted to go, showed them my orders. And it was all pretty snazzy and new, and people saluting you and stuff like that. And I said, whoa, this is weird. I didn't have any uniforms or anything like that. I was in civilian clothes, and I go over to the Marine Aviation Detachment, and I have a warrant officer or lieutenant, or I can't remember his rank at the time, was Suarez. And I'll never forget him. He just said, Lieutenant, he says, you'll be here tomorrow morning at such and such a time, and be here. We've got a augmentation going on, and we'll give you a brief and everything. And so I showed up, and it's where I met some of my lifelong friends from the Marine Corps. We're right there in that MAD detachment. And as we sat there waiting for some sort of a briefing, we were all in our civilian clothes in these school desks. In walks Colonel Donald Conroy, the great Santini. I didn't know he was the great Santini at that time. But he walked in, he was bigger than life, full bird colonel. And he gave us a brief, I probably will never forget it, told us what life was going to be for us for the rest of our lives, and that this was a changing moment in our time, and that we would always be Marine aviators after this, and that you could never outlive it. It would always be there. He was just a great guy to talk to. Anyway, that was our start, and they told us to go out and get some uniforms. And I was lost. So Suarez came over and said, well, I suggest you guys go out to this tailor that's just outside the main gate, or else over to the officer's store and find you some uniforms. They'll tell you what you need. And we did. A group of us went over to this tailor outside of the Pensacola gate there, and he fitted us all. And I'll never forget one of the things that struck me. I was a yokel from Missouri. I didn't know any of this stuff. He says to me, and my wife is standing there with me, and he says, well, sir, do you dress right or do you dress left? I looked at him and I says, do I dress right or do I dress left? What are you talking about? He says, do you dress right? And he had a southern accent, or do you dress left? And of course, me and everybody else in the room that was there, I think Jim Smith was there and Dave Owens, and we were all kind of looking at each other. And then he whispers up to my ear and he says, which side of the seam of your pants do you hang on? I about died. And I thought my wife was going to fall on the floor. And I said, well, hell, I don't know. I never looked. And so we finally figured it all out and got tailor fitted for our uniforms, and had to go take a loan out at Pensacola Air Credit Union in order to buy them, somewhere around $1,000. I don't remember what it was. But we had the full thing. So I had this big full box full of uniforms, and we went back to our little tiny apartment that we had that didn't have any furniture or anything in it. We couldn't afford anything. And laid everything out on the floor and tried to figure out how to wear it. We never had any instruction on any of that kind of stuff, how the sword hung or anything like that. We never had any classes on it. So we were figuring stuff out and how the uniforms went together, and we got down and we had been told to wear what to wear to work. So at that time, since it was summer, we had summer service Charlies, which was just a tan shirt and a tan trousers that we wore. And so we put our bars on and like they had told us to do, and we showed up down there all brand spanking new second lieutenants to start school. And we went to ground school, and ground school was several weeks. A couple of other guys and myself had remedial ground school where we had to take extra courses in mathematics and physics and aerodynamics so that we could pass muster. And they were very good about that, giving you a little leeway. It was very obvious at that time that they wanted us to complete that training. And they wanted us to complete it rather fast. They were pushing us pretty hard. We didn't know how bad they needed us. We didn't know exactly that there were a lot of helicopter pilots in Vietnam that were dying. We didn't have that information at the time, but they were sure pushing us, and they had mentioned that the typical syllabus would be 18 months, and we would be pushed through quite a bit faster than that. So we went through our ground school and started flying out at Sofley Field and got our first solos and everything. And we met all these Marine captains that had come back and done their tours in Vietnam. And so we were hearing the stories, and things were starting to get pretty exciting, and we got our training done. And it took me 18 months, not 18 months, I'm sorry, 14 months. And in September of 1969, I finished my training. I had 76 hours of, by that time I had T-34, T-28 time, and I'd been carrier qualed out at the carrier. And I had 76 hours in the old H-34, which I just dearly loved, the H-34. It was just such a fun aircraft to fly. And we used to call it the shiver and shudder and shake and shit house. I mean, you really had to concentrate on those instrument panels because they shook so bad. You had to follow where they were, what it was really reading. But I just loved the throttle, and I loved everything about it. Loved climbing up into it and being so high off the ground. Everything about it was just a lot of fun. And so after that, we got orders, and my orders were to the West Coast, to Santa Ana, and to the Marine Corps Air Station at Santa Ana, and to fly transition for the 46. So took some leave, went out to Tustin, California, and got a small apartment, reported on the base to HMMT 302. The CO was Colonel Ken Vanek. We used to call him Panic Vanek. And we started our transition into the CH-46. It's also where I learned a lot more about being a Marine officer out there at that time, because I was now surrounded by other Marine officers, and we learned a lot more about Vietnam. I flew with guys like Pat Donovan and Sullivan, all the guys that were coming back, a lot of them Purple Foxes. And I heard about the Purple Foxes, and I had heard about their exploits and things like that. And so I was starting to get into the thick of it, and I fell in love with the CH-46. I thought it was a fairly hard aircraft to fly at first, but I loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved learning things about it. And it was massive to me. There were so many, everything was dual hydraulic systems. Learning about the jet engine was all pretty much different to me, and I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed California. I enjoyed the hills out in Silverado Canyon and going up and learning how to do external loads, flying in with an external load to a position, and we spent some time out at Catalina Island and around the coast, and it was just pretty cool flying. And I also got, at that time, I got to check out on the 50 caliber. We got qualified as 50 caliber machine gun operators in case we needed to do it. So we went out to the machine gun range at Camp Pendleton with the 46 and were able to shoot the 50 off of that. I was really impressed with that. And I was on an adventure. This is the way I was brought up. Adventures were more important than learning anything. And so this was an adventure to me, and got ourselves all prepped up, and we were ready to go. And I saw my name up on this board to go to Vietnam, and they were waiting. They had a rotation. We had a big pool of guys that had kind of bottled up there at Santa Ana. And so it got to be December of '69, and I thought, boy, we're not moving. I mean, a couple guys went over. Doug Orahood left and went, and I said, boy, this is kind of backing up. And then, and we had caught up with quite a few of the guys that were ahead of us. So they transferred a bunch of us over to HMM 163, which was a 46 squadron at Santa Ana, and started flying with some of these folks like Norm Baumkamp and several others over there. And those guys had passed on some more information to us about Vietnam, and we got into more operational type flying. They started teaching us a lot of things, like different kinds of approaches other than a strict NATOPS approach. They taught us the real fine-tuning of what it was going to be like to fly in Vietnam. A great bunch of guys, and they gave us all the flight time we needed. And they were trying to build our flight time. And I was beginning to wonder if we were even going to go to Vietnam. And so in February, I think it was, of 1970, I finally got my orders to 1st Marine Air Wing, Vietnam. So I took my leave. My wife and I dropped her off in St. Louis, left her and I had a daughter at that time, a young daughter, and left them in St. Louis and said goodbye and got on a plane and went out to L.A. and took off out of Norton, California on a MAC V flight. We flew into Hawaii, 45 minutes in Hawaii to refuel, and on to, I believe, Okinawa was our next stop. And we stayed out at the camp there. They had a camp, processing camp. I can't quite remember the name of it offhand right now, but we stayed there for a couple of days. And it was at that time that they clarified that some of us were going to stay at the 1st Marine Air Wing rear. If your orders said rear, nobody understood those orders at first. And there was an R behind it. And so if you were classified with that R, you stayed in Okinawa. And that upset quite a few guys. They were really hoping to go to Vietnam. And we were kidding around. Charlie Rodenberg and I, who ended up in 263 eventually. Charlie and I were arguing back and forth. I said, well, you can take my orders, Charlie, if you're that upset about it. You know, and so we went to this major, and the major said, no, it ain't going to happen. So we were just kidding around anyway. I really did want to go to Vietnam. I wanted to do my part. I remember this gunnery sergeant, we were in this big hangar in this room, and this gunnery sergeant comes up in front of the group of lieutenants, and he says, now, you're going to rotate into Vietnam. We got a couple of things we want you to do. And they handed us this book, and it said, Experiences of Vietnam. And it was a handwritten book that they put to type, and it was everybody's collective ideas of, you know, what to avoid, you know, booby traps and things like that. And I'm thinking, we're pilots. What are you telling us about booby traps for? You know, and so I went ahead and got myself prepped for that. And this gunnery sergeant also told us that we're going to give you a box. We want you to put your uniform in a box and put your name on it and your next of kin where it's going to be sent to. He says, and if you don't make it, then 1 out of 2 of you won't. That's what he said. He says, we'll send this on to your next of kin. And if you do make it, you'll come back through here and you'll find your box and take it home with you. And they issued us our jungle utilities at that point and any other flight gear they thought we needed. And we were on a C-130 headed for Vietnam. And we had a stopover in the Philippines to refuel and pick up a few more passengers, and then we went on into Vietnam and landed. It was late at night, probably 7, 8 o'clock at night in Da Nang. Went over to the 1st Marine Air Wing, met with this bird colonel. He says, all right, he says, what are you guys flying? What are your MOSs? And he signed us all to squadrons, and I was assigned to 364. I didn't realize the whole Purple Fox thing quite at that point, but went over to 364 and checked in and found out that 364, well, I'll back up a little bit. So that night we drive over, and we drove from Da Nang over to Marble Mountain Airfield, and I remember being in the back of that 6x truck, group of us. We didn't have any guns or anything like that, and we're head out of that gate at Da Nang at night. And I wasn't sure what to expect as we started heading over towards Marble, and I guess it was a couple of miles, 4 miles, and cross that famous bridge over the Cao Dao River, whatever it was over there, and it just got kind of spooky. And I thought, I hope these guys that are driving this truck have a rifle or something, that somebody attacks us out here. Because in your mind, you really don't know what's going on. And so we get over to Marble and check in with the group there, and they just, the only people that were up right then was the clerks. And they told us, they told me, Lieutenant, you just go down and stay at the transient officer quarters. Now that's a big mouthful for Marble Mountain. And so I looked, they took me over there, this young clerk took me down there, and there was a screen door, and it said TOQ on it. It was just a little hooch. And walked in and woke up people that were trying to sleep. One of them was Kevin Kuklik, who ended up retiring as a CG of the 4th Marine Air Wing, and as a general. And but Kevin was there, and he was going to fly Cobras, and I knew Kevin from Pensacola, and he smiled, and as he woke up to see who was there. And when you first came in that little officer thing, it was just a bathroom, and he said, well, there's an empty bunk over there, and the lights were all out, and I stumbled across, and I don't even think I took my uniform off. I just laid down on the bunk until I could see something in the morning. It's pitch black. Next morning I got up, went to group headquarters, and they said, you're assigned to 364, and they had a Jeep take me down to the squadron area. I walked into the squadron area, and there was a ready room, and I got this look like, who the hell are you? And guy walked up to me. I don't remember who it was. He says, can I help you? And I had my flight gear with me. And I said, well, yeah, I'm so-and-so, and I'm checking in. Well, you're in the wrong place. This squadron's going home. We were told we're going home. You're in the wrong squadron. Where'd they tell you to go? I said 364. All of a sudden, a bunch of guys just got really ticked off. And they said, this can't possibly be, because they thought they were winding down. So I went in, reported to admin, and they introduced me to the colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Scaglione. They welcomed me aboard and everything. And that's when these guys found out they're not going home. They're staying there, and they're bringing more pilots in. And so they right away put my name over on the board that said FNG. And I said, well, what's FNG mean? He said, you're the frickin' new guy, so shut up. You have no say-so in anything. And they were kind of rough about that. And I remember Roger Combs was still listed on there as FNG. And now I showed up, and he said to me, he was the only guy smiling. He went over to the board, and he erased his FNG and wrote in Roscoe. He had himself a nickname, and I was the new FNG. And so the guy that came in after me, I think it might have been Dave Owens or somebody, and they put NFNG next to him. So we had FNG and the new FNG. So these guys were not happy. And so I didn't get a great welcome. And one of the things that really impressed me, though, was that how organized everything was. Things were happening. Things were going on. I got assigned my hooch. I got into this hooch. It was the original hooch was a regular sea hooch down by the sea. Got my any other gear they needed to give me. Got assigned a cubicle and all that kind of stuff, and for where to store my gear out in the hangar. And I was scheduled for my first flight. And my first flight was with Lieutenant Colonel Scaglione. And I had no idea who his personality or anything. So I show up for the flight, and he checks me out. He gives me an inspection of what I had. They have maps. Yeah, I had these maps. I had like 4 or 5 of them. And he says, well, you can't open up those in the cockpit. You got to have those put together. Well, no one had told me that. Anyway, so I was just being ripped. And Scaglione knew how to rip you. And he was just so critical, and he criticized everything I did. And by the time the flight was over, and I had shot approaches on that flight. He took me down to Anwa and stuff, and I shot an approach into Anwa, and he says, chewed me out. That wasn't an ATOPS approach. And I'm thinking, well, this is what 163 pilots taught me. You know, why is this wrong? And so anyway, I had a bad flight. It was really bad. I came back to the ready room, and Frenchy Lagat, Dave Lagat, ran up to me right away and said, how was that flight? And I said, it wasn't very good. I said, I don't know what's going to happen. I got to figure something out. I said, I didn't know anything. I thought I knew stuff. I didn't know what I was supposed to know. And these guys are all laughing. I didn't realize it was a setup. And so Frenchie comes over to me. He says, well, he says, I'll fly with you tomorrow and show you a really good flight, show you what it's supposed to look like. So they scheduled me with Dave Lagat for the next morning, and I take off with him, and I don't remember what kind of a mission it was or anything that morning, but I think it was medevac. I know it was medevac, yeah. And we picked up a medevac, and we had to go out to, and I was really trying hard. I wanted to have this a perfect flight, so and Dave was very good. He was instructing me as we went. This is how you do it. And he says, now I want you to take this medevac. We got off we're flying back towards Da Nang, and he says, get us to the hospital ship. And I said, I don't know what the hospital ship looks like. I don't know where it's at. He said, it's real easy. It's a big white ship with a big red cross. You cannot miss it. And it's at Da Nang Harbor. I said, okay, that's good. So I concentrated. I'm flying. I wanted to impress him that I could stay at altitude. I could keep the ball in the middle. I could fly this helicopter. I could do a good job, follow instructions. And I come flying up into Da Nang, and all of a sudden I see this big white ship sitting on this port, and it's got this big red cross on it, and I'm going to miss it. I'm going to overfly it, and I panic, and I say, oh, my God. So I start my approach in and everything, and he lets me go all the way into where I'm coming right down on top of that red cross. And I'm thinking, boy, I salvaged that. And all of a sudden, he grabs the controls and starts screaming at me. He says, what the hell are you doing? And pulls the helicopter off and pulls it back up into the air. And I said, what? What? And he says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm landing on the ship. He says, that's the SS Hildeland. That's an East German hospital ship. They cater to the Viet Cong. And that's not a landing pad. That's an awning over the back of that ship. And I was just mortified. I said, how could I have made that mistake? And he drives a little bit farther, and he's got that shit-eating grin on his face as he gets out over Da Nang Bay. And he says, now that's a hospital ship. And there was this big, beautiful white hospital ship. He says, do you think you could land now on that, in the right ship? So I had no idea this was set up. So I go and I do that. And of course, I feel terrible when we get back to the ready room, and I'm dragging in, and I getting all my gear, and Dave's waiting. He's already in there, and he's telling these guys, he says, hear ye, gather around. I want to introduce you to your new pilot. And I'm thinking, oh, God, this is embarrassing enough. Why do you have to do that? And he says, I want to introduce you boys to Charles Lindbergh. This is a replica of Charles Lindbergh. Oh, Swift Chuck. He says, this guy, and he explains the whole thing. Well, the ready room is rolling on the ground, and I am the butt of this tremendous joke. And I'm just thinking, my God, these first 2 days of flying, it cannot get much worse. And Steve Erb comes up to me and he says, don't worry, Chuck. He says, you'll fly with me tomorrow. Everything will be fine. I'll fly with you. So the next day I go out with Erb and we go out flying and get ready to do the brief. And he says, now listen, this is the way it's going to work. I don't want you to touch anything. I want you to just sit in that chair and be quiet because I've heard about you, Chuck. And I go, oh, gosh, I can't believe they would do this. So we went on. We had a non-eventful flight. And, of course, Steve comes back and still playing the joke. Yep, there we were, trying to rescue a guy right out of a tree down through the jungle penetrator. And there was Chuck just sitting there. Well, that's what I was told to do, you know. But anyway, they had their fun. And I ended up spending my time flying, and we had some great times, and we had some bad ones, but I laughed. I thought you have to have humor in all of this, and the Foxes were very good with their humor. Had a very tight-knit outfit, flew a lot of fun stuff, some stuff not so much fun, a couple of bad flights. One was August 7th, 1970. I'll never forget it. Major Dwayne Jensen was giving me one of my hack checks for becoming a helicopter aircraft commander, and we had a night medevac that night, and our wingman was Bob Marshall was a pilot, Jim Gillies was a co-pilot, and we went south. We were down near the Baldy area to pick up. It was a CAP unit, emergency medevac, and we landed down there to do that. And as we picked up our medevac, we were headed back up to Charlie Med, and we flew right over this firefight that was going on there. And Bob Marshall came up on the air and he said, I think we're going to get a call. There's a firefight going on down here. We'll probably get a call. And sure enough, while we were transiting over the top, we got a call for that particular unit down there, had a medevac. So Bob says, I got a corpsman on board, which we didn't always have on the chase aircraft. He says, why don't I just take this? And Major Jensen said, well, yeah, you can take it, Bob, but why don't you wait till we get back so we've got one in the air behind you. So Bob orbited while the gunships went down and prepped the area, got the brief, and did all of that while we ran up to Da Nang, dropped off our medevac, and came back. And we were at probably 1,500 feet. And when we got back, and we radioed when we got into the area for Bob to go ahead and proceed. And so they went down, and we were listening. We couldn't see anything. It was pitch black night. We could see some tracers and things going on, but we were listening to the radio. And Bob was talking to the people on the ground and on the Marines down there, and they landed. And ramp was down. We were listening to the chatter, and the guy was on, and we're pulling off. We're off. And it's silent, and we're waiting for him to come to altitude and say he was going to join on us. Next thing we heard was, we're on our way back in. We got to go back in. We didn't get the medevac. And everything seemed kind of strange at that point, and they went back in, and the next thing we heard was coming out of the zone, and then we didn't hear anything. And then the gunships came up and said, Swift, you got a down aircraft, and it's on fire, you know. And right away, Major Jensen said, I've got the aircraft, and we dropped it on its side and did our spiral down into the zone at night. And we come flying in, and you could see this ball of fire. It was just awful. Anyway, we landed, got them out. Well, we could. took him up to the 95th evac, and we got relieved that night. And I think Major Van Leeuwen and Dave Owens, I believe, took it over. And we went back and did our debrief and filed our reports. And next day, we stayed up all night. We were waiting for information. We didn't know what was going on. We just knew there was a bunch of burning bodies and people, and we had seen enough of our guys jumping in and out of the aircraft, our Marine grunts that were covering themselves with mud and jumping into that burning aircraft and pulling guys out. Well, we had no idea what we had on board when we went to the 95th evac, and we didn't know who was who. But anyway, we had a pilot in the evac. We were missing a pilot, and the next morning they told us that Jim Gillies was in the evac, and he was in pretty bad shape, and that Bob Marshall was missing. So eventually they figured out that morning that it wasn't Jim. It was Bob that was in the hospital, and Jim was missing. And what had happened was the seats in the CH-46, the helicopter had hit on its side, and the seats had sheared off. And Bob's seat was down where Jim's seat used to be, and Jim's seat was buried into the ground, into the mud of the rice paddy. And they had retrieved Bob. And we were told he was going to be medevaced out of the country. He was in pretty tough shape. And we didn't hear any more after that for a long time. But the next day, they did find Jim Gillies' body, and I remember our flight surgeon, Ray Moyer, said that he was dead on impact. The trauma was so instant that it just slammed them so hard into the ground that it was just, it sheared the seats. Anyway, that was a bad one. And a couple of others, you know, when you're hauling kids, and kids are blown apart from landmines and crap like that, that you ended up not thinking about it. You made a big mistake if you ever looked in the back and saw what was back there. So you learned not to do that. And I made a mistake one time of sitting on the back of the hospital ship, and they were bringing the medevac around to the side, and we had picked up this Republic of Korea Marine who had stepped on a landmine, and as he came by, he was holding his leg and begging everybody to make sure they didn't lose his leg. And that one got to me, and then I decided at that point I wasn't going to look at anything anymore. I did like the hospital ship. One of the things about that hospital ship and the 95th evac and Charlie Med was that when they came out to that helicopter and got you, there were fresh sheets on the gurneys, or they had fresh, clean clothes on. They changed them after they'd get them all dirty, and they'd put fresh ones on so they keep everything sterile. And that whole sterile smell used to make me think that this is the one part that you can still stay attached to America. It's this cleanliness, this sanitation, and I love that smell. And I remember being on the hospital ship one day, and they're taking the medevac off, and I don't remember who the co-pilot was, and I told him, I says, anything happens to me, you bring me here. I don't care where they tell you to take me. You bring me to the back of this ship. I said, because this is America. This ship is America. You bring me here. So that impacted me, and let's get to some fun stuff. That was depressing. I had a lot of fun. I flew one day with Walt Wise, and it was his first hack hop, and I was his co-pilot, and I was a senior co-pilot at that time. And Walt had always wanted to land on Highway 1. So we took off, and he was going to land on Highway 1. He sets up for an approach, and I'm thinking, you got to be kidding me. You're crazy. What are we doing? There's cars, there's people on bicycles, everything's on Highway 1. Why are you going to land on Highway 1? He said, I always wanted to do it. So he sets up, and he comes down, he puts the 46, you could put your back tires on pavement and keep your nose off and just run down the highway. He did that. And these guys are just peeling off the highway into the ditches as Walt's going down and just laughing as he goes down through there. And I thought, we're going to get hung by Scaglione on this thing when we get back. We're going to get hung. But we didn't. They never caught us. A couple of other times, Bob Stocker was a forward air controller, and I had to fly down, do some missions around him. They were actually Marines were pulling out of Anwa, and we knew it was going to get overrun by NVA. We've been watching them, and the intelligence had been saying it. So Bob was a forward air controller with a team, and they put him down at Anwa, and they said, you're going to call in air and artillery on this group that's coming, that we know will come as we pull these troops out. So I told Bob I was flying over, and he was talking to me on the radios, and I said, I'll bring you something back. So after my flights were over, I had asked the crews up at the maintenance crews to put together some engine cans, put together some ice and oranges and beer, and I'd take it out to Bob and the boys. It might be their last night. And I did that, and boy, I got in a lot of trouble with Skaggs on that. I got accused of stealing an aircraft, didn't have an authorized flight and all that. And I did a lot of those kind of rug dances. I got in a rug dance because I did a VR with a Marine lieutenant who was out doing a 81 millimeter mortar operation, and he wanted to VR an area out by Spider Lake near the Quaisans, and there were a lot of guys running around out there, and he says, those guys are all supposed to be dead. And so he says, start shooting them. So in the way things were, you had to get permission to shoot. You couldn't do that. The rules of engagement wouldn't let you do that. So I said, well, we'll have to call Da Nang Das. And he said, no, you don't. He says, this is my fire mission. All you got to do is shoot. We were still at a live fire mission going on here. So we started shooting, and then Major Jensen was in the area, and we were single bird, and he called. He says, can I join you? That was a smart move on his part because he saw that here was this single bird helicopter out there flying around shooting stuff up, and that wasn't safe. And so he came over and kind of made it as a safety deal, and he was behind me and everything. But I'm the one that got in trouble when I got back with Colonel Scaglione. He had me do a write-up and chewed me out and gave me a lecture on My Lai Massacre, and I went through the whole thing with him. I thought, good Lord. I said, I tried to explain to him it was a VR, and it was a live fire mission still in a... No, you write this whole thing up. This is so bad. Anyway, I did what he told me to do. I didn't get another fun time another rug dance until I flew one night when I shouldn't have. I had been drinking with a bunch of guys and forgot that I was on last bird of Mission 80. And the last bird of Mission 80 has to go get the frags over at Da Nang at night, at 8 o'clock at night. And they came down to get me, and I was wasted. And I said, I can't fly. And they couldn't find anybody else either. Everybody else was wasted. And so I ended up, and they said, your co-pilot's waiting. And so it was Daryl Cooper. So I ran down to the flight line, and that made it worse. Ran from up at the Old Club down the flight line, got down there, and Cooper was waiting in the aircraft, and I jumped in and told Cooper that, you got this bird ready to go? And he looked at me, and you could just tell by the look on his face, like, holy moly, can you fly? And I wouldn't let him answer. I'd ask any questions. I said, I got it. I started taxiing out to the runway, and I said to the tower, I said, Tower, this is Swift 1-4 for takeoff. Swift 1-4, are you forgetting something? Tower, this is Swift 1-4, takeoff. Swift, aren't you forgetting something? Look, you flying this helicopter, or am I flying this helicopter? I want permission to take off. Okay, Swift. So I go out and I position for takeoff, and I said, ready for takeoff. And Tower says, Swift, one last time, you sure you aren't forgetting something? I said, what is your problem, Tower? He said, well, there's a courier waiting for you at the base of the tower that you're supposed to take over to Da Nang. Well, that was the whole mission. And So I went back, and the frags were fragmentary missions, that they called them. And so I grabbed him, went back to the tower. I was embarrassed, got out, took off, eventually got going. And it was a dark night, and we were flying low over to Da Nang, and I was explaining to Cooper, you know, that you want to be careful when you're out here going even at night from Da Nang. You could get shot and all this other stuff. So I started running down the Cao Dao River, and we're down around tree level or lower, and we're just having a good time flying down the river, and I'm talking to Cooper and preoccupied, and it seemed like it was taking us a long time to get to Da Nang. And the crew chief says, you know, sir, this is a lot of fun, but you ought to take a look off your back right. And I looked real quick, and here come a whole bunch of tracers out of the trees. And so we just pulled high. I mean, I just pulled everything she had and started climbing. And the tracers went right underneath us, and I looked, and I said, holy moly, where are we? And I could see Da Nang way off in the distance. I thought, man, we had turned south on that river. I wasn't sure how far south we had gone. Anyway, I set up an approach, and long approach. I was probably at 1,500 feet by that time, and I called Da Nang. I said, Da Nang Tower, this is Swift 14, inbound for their to the such and such pad for Mission 80. Anyway, Tower says, Roger, come on in, but be advised, you've got traffic. Your traffic is 5 miles at such and such a direction. Well, it was us. And so I said, Roger, and I'm looking for traffic and things like that, you know, and we get down, and coming in, we're about a half a mile out, and I call in and on final, and they said, Roger, Swift, I think you have traffic right with you, that same traffic. I said, no, that's us. And there was just silence, because they had no idea, because normally we would just come over from Marble Mountain. It wasn't a long flight from the south. But we landed. It was another uneventful night, and that all went fine and dandy until there was a going away party for a bunch of pilots, and Cooper decided to tell the story, how wonderful it was to be in a squadron with the great pilots of the Purple Foxes, and he told the story of that night, and that was also a change of command when Colonel Stedman was replacing Colonel Staglione, and I got called into Colonel Stedman's office the next morning, and yeah, I stood in front of him and did a rug dance, and he said, real nice guy, he says, Pat, he says, you know, I like to drink beer. I like to have a drink with everybody just like you do. He says, and then he stood up and he looked at me, he said, but if you ever fly one of my aircraft again in the state you flew that aircraft in, he says, I will have you busted to where you will never see the light of day again. He scared the crap out of me. And then he sat down, he said, now get out here and don't ever let this happen again. And I went out and I walked across the hallway into the bathroom, and I remember throwing water on my face and looking in the mirror and thought, you dumb SOB. You know, what a dumb thing to do. And that was the truth. God took care of us, and even in spite of me being stupid. Anyway, that was my, I eventually went to Atsugi and as a test pilot with that program, spent 4.5 months up there and came back, spent my last 45 days in Vietnam, and had orders to, in April of 1971, to go to the 1st Marine Division in Camp Pendleton. And I thought, well, here's the payback for all the rug dances. I'm going to be a grunt for a year. And I thought I was going to be an air liaison officer. Well, when I showed up at the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines of the 1st Marine Corps Division out at Camp Horno, Camp Pendleton, I got a whole new awakening. And I was told that you can just remove your wings, you can remove that whole idea of being an air liaison officer. We need grunt captains. And that's what you are for a year. And I became a battalion in S3 Assistant, Alpha, they called it. And I learned how to be a grunt officer, and it was the first time in my entire career in Marine Corps, which was 6 years long, that I actually lived the life of a Marine, I thought. Everything about the Marine infantry and that just drilled into me, and I had to do training and stuff like that with a battalion, and I learned it all in that 1 year. It was a great year. Then I went on to 2 more years in the service attached to the Navy at Pensacola as a flight instructor in the T-28s, and I enjoyed it very much. I loved it. Then I got out and went to work for 26 years in the agricultural industry with various different positions and jobs and more adventures. And then retired from agriculture and went into financial business, and that's what I do today. Pretty much retired, but I still try to work for 3-4 hours a day in that. And with that, I look back, and I'll always be a Purple Fox. I'll always be a Marine. The Purple Foxes were the greatest group of gentlemen I've ever associated with in my entire life. And to this day, I love the reunions. I love staying in touch. I have many reunions of my own where I go visit Purple Fox buddies. I try to stay in touch with them as much as possible. They're my family. I'm closer to them than I am to anybody else that I know of. I have a lot of friends, but these guys are special, and they have a lot of meaning in my life.